Good morning and welcome to our webinar, A Clinical Investigator's Perspective, Novel Oncology Therapy During and Beyond the COVID Pandemic. I'm Arsalan Arif, the publisher of Endpoints News, and I'm pleased to present our panel this morning. Following the rise of COVID-19, an ASCO survey found that nearly 60% of oncology programs halted screening and recruitment. More than half of all programs also reported a decrease in patient availability and willingness to participate in these trials. So these challenges are not going away anytime soon. Experts predict infections well into summer 2021, and these impacts will be felt even longer. So it's imperative that we re-examine the space to ensure oncology trials can continue to weather this storm and rise to future challenges. So today, we have an approximately 60-minute panel session today. It's first a discussion, and then we're going to move to a Q&A from the audience. And I encourage the audience to use the Q&A button and to submit your questions. We're going to get to as many as possible and follow up with you offline when able. So now to my panel. First up, I have Dr. Michael Gordon. He's the medical director at the Honor Health Research Institute in Scottsdale, Arizona. Next, Dr. Nita Somaiya, who's the associate professor and deputy chair of sarcoma medical oncology at the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas. Next up, I have Gaurav Sharma, the senior VP therapeutic area leader for oncology and hematology at Worldwide Clinical Trials. So now let's get started with our panel. I've got a question here first, and I'm going to pose that to our panel. But first, before I do that, I'd like to give each of the doctors a little bit of a chance to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about what they're doing. Dr. Gordon, how about you first?
Well, thank you, Arsalan. It's a pleasure to be participating in this panel with a distinguished group of colleagues. So I'm a medical oncologist by training, have been an academician for most of my career, and currently I'm the medical director of the Honor Health Research Institute, which is a multidisciplinary research enterprise affiliated with our hospital system. My focus of area of interest is in phase 1 trials, and we have a very large phase 1 program that serves the greater Phoenix metropolitan area and outside of that region.
And I am, as introduced, Nita Somaiya, and I'm also really happy to be part of this distinguished panel. A very relevant topic in today's time. I've been at Anderson since 2012, and I have been an academic medical oncologist for my career so far. And I also am the director of the clinical research in the sarcoma department. So we oversee, I oversee around 16 active trials that we have ongoing, and also oversee the process of new trials opening. So we've been kind of in a thick and thin of things with the whole COVID crisis over the past couple of months. So I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion today.
Thank you. And how about you, Gaurav?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. My name is Gaurav Sharma, and I represent Worldwide Clinical Trials, and my role as a therapeutic area leader is to ensure that we work with, specifically with the biotech customers and leading investigators such as Dr. Somaiya and Dr. Gordon to deliver an oncology and hematology projects on time and get the right medicine out to the patients.
All right, thank you for that. So let's just get right to our questions here. Dr. Somaiya, I'm going to pose this one to you first, but I'm going to want everyone to really gather in and give us their experience here. But Dr. Somaiya, what has been your experience with continuing successful clinical research during COVID?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. For the last 5 to 6 months, there has been, I would say, a rapid change pretty much on a weekly, if not daily basis of how we operate, clinical research based on not only the risk at that time, but also the knowledge we have gained of how to mitigate the risk for our patients and continuing clinical research. So, the initial experience obviously was that we, back in March, our first phase was to shut off, just as you mentioned, accrual to clinical trials that were not essential. So our goal was, how do we keep patients safely on trial who are currently enrolled on trial? And we decided within each department which are the trials that are offering a drug that there is no standard of care alternative to, that we have to keep open for them. So that's what we achieved, and that gave us time to actually build in processes that made it safe at Anderson, right? We had to make sure we had enough PPE. We had to get our front door screening, temperature screening or questionnaire screening. We had to establish which ATCs are going to be used, or the chemo infusion centers are going to be converted to COVID centers, perhaps. Even the inpatient, which units are going to be COVID, which are going to be non-COVID, how to separate them. Some sites were actually converted into COVID testing centers. So once we had that COVID infrastructure in place that made it safe for not only the patients but also the employees to come in and feel like they could, perform their functions, we then opened up the second phase of clinical research, where we were allowing us to open all the trials that we felt we could safely do, but we still kept our research staff remote. So, all the research staff that are non-essential, non-patient facing, are doing remote work. So that's a lot of them. And, we've realized that a lot can be done remotely. You don't really need to be sitting in your office, at work to actually conduct research in today's times. But there was still some restrictions in terms of, PK collections and biopsy collections that over time, once we have determined that we can safely socially distance and keep those patients, schedule the PKs and research biopsies in advance, they have now opened up those facilities for clinical research. So right now, almost all our trials are back up and running with there are changes in terms of what can be safely done, how much travel is required by the patient, and which ones are we successfully accruing to and which ones we're not. And we are having to schedule things in advance because we can't put in last minute biopsy requests or last minute PK requests if they're not being scheduled in advance. So I think, the experience has been, we've learned a lot, and we have learned what things are absolutely essential for clinical research to happen and what things can be done remotely with virtual visits and with mailing medications, even research medications, which are oral, things that make it easier for patients. So I'll be interested to hear what Dr. Gordon's view has been over and how they have managed over the past couple of months.
Yeah, I think we had a very similar experience. We're obviously much smaller than MD Anderson in Houston, and as a result, perhaps that was to our advantage. Our hospital system and our medical group took the lead on establishing the community-based net needs for COVID testing, but I think your point about the oncology research enterprise is exactly correct. We did not have to turn down any or turn off any trials and continue to actually open new studies, but with a different frame of reference. And so moving all of our patient-facing, non-patient-facing individuals off-site, allowing remote visits for monitors, which really went extremely well given technology. I think one of the biggest challenges at an institutional level was the global number of employees for the hospital system who were suddenly working remotely, and the hospital system actually had to significantly upgrade the ability to do that. To your point of biopsies, it was obviously very difficult when elective procedures were curtailed. And I think much like I'm sure you had, we served as the advocates for our patients so that whether it was a clinical trial or a standard of care, there were certain things such as diagnostic biopsies and portacath placements, which were necessities for treatment, that were placed high on the list for not being elective, but being urgent and necessary. And I think that's a very important aspect of evolving the patient care, which is playing the advocate, not only for our patients, for our staff, right? Because I think that for many of our medical staff who were patient-facing, there was a lot of anxiety, the evolving changes of CDC recommendations that had to be implemented in real time relative to those issues. And I think it's been an ongoing but successful challenge.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely there that it was, the challenge of first making sure everyone was safe, you're saying, patients and the employees. And in terms of advocating, I think there was a lot of, the whole clinical research at Anderson really advocated to the higher ups in the institute to tell them how important clinical research was for oncology patients, because it's not just, there are standard of cares and they could, do it. These treatments actually do make a difference. And it's important for us to count clinical research as an important aspect of delivering cancer care, and count it as essential. And that helped us get our operations up faster. So that has been definitely helpful, the advocating.
Very well said.
I think one of the things that we experienced that was a very surprising opportunity was we met early and made a decision at the Research Institute that because there were certain programs, our bariatric research program, for example, which were going to be placed on hold because those studies and device studies were elective in nature, that we had personnel and research personnel who would otherwise be furloughed, and we were able to repurpose them, and we actually initiated an entire COVID-19 research program covering both convalescent plasma and interventions. And Nita, you probably had a similar experience to us. It was amazing how many oncology companies were repurposing drugs for COVID. And because of our experience and our standards and our ability to do the job well, we became focal points for lots of opportunity for over 800 patients on trial in a matter of about 5 months, which has been phenomenal. But it just goes to show you, when you're focused on something like cancer trials or COVID trials, you can actually move great barriers in a rapid fashion in the urgent and emergent state.
Gaurav, how about the CRO's take on this?
No, thanks for asking, Arslan. I think from the CRO or from the pharma industry point of view, I use this term, something called forced creativity. We are in that phase of forced creativity. If you remember, I think it's been over 5 or 7 years, we've been talking about remote monitoring, we've been talking about reduced SDVs, but biotechs and pharma has been very much driven by doing everything on site, because there was a mantra of saying nothing beats being face-to-face. So there was a lot of travel, a lot of burden for the site staff as well to be available during the monitoring and schedule those visits. But I think what pandemic has done, in a kind of a silver lining, if you may, that we are doing things differently. We are doing true remote monitoring. The access to electronic health records, the EMRs, has made it possible to do just not remote TMF review, but you can actually do a proper remote monitoring with the use of other platforms such as eSource, which existed for quite some time, but there was a very less uptick on sponsors to say I'm going to use the eSource. So there is the eSource, there is the e-consent, and a lot of other things that Dr. Somaya was saying, home nursing, how to mail in the medications for the patients. So reducing the burden for the patient as well, right? So if you're talking about the patient centricity, you're reducing the burden on the patient as well. And I truly hope that, once the pandemic is behind us, that these practices are going to stick on, because this time has shown us that you can be equally, if not more, productive by cutting down a lot of unnecessary, travel time, and you can do a lot of productivity just sitting in your office and having the access to the database.
Oops, I was on mute. No, and I plan on asking the panel more about exactly what of this forced creativity is going to last with us once the pandemic is over. That's a very good point. But I'm going to go on to the next prompt over here. And this one's really for the doctors here. Due to your close contact with patients, tell us what you've been hearing from the participants themselves during COVID. Dr. Somaya or Gordon?
Dr. Gordon, you want to take this first?
Sorry, yeah, I'll jump first. I think that first, there's a tremendous degree of gratitude from our patients, most of whom are coming to us seeking clinical trials, because many of our patients are seeking phase 1 trials, they oftentimes are at a critical point in the continuum of their care. They may have been told by their doctors in the community that there were limited or no other options. And so there's a tremendous degree of gratitude from them, from their families. It's definitely been more difficult because of the restrictions that we've placed. When we have patients coming in for new visit consults, we allow one individual with them. For the review of imaging studies and decision-making of critical nature, one individual. But otherwise, we don't allow guests or family members. They can be called in, obviously. And we don't allow guests and family members in the infusion area. We've required masks to be worn by all patients, which takes some discussion. But I think that in general, recognizing how medicine has changed and how many physicians are not seeing patients in their offices and are just doing telemedicine visits, I think that the patients really appreciate the hands-on phenomenon of coming in and seeing us, seeing our staff, and actually seeing that degree of normalcy that exists within our walls. And yes, they have to jump through hoops. They have to obviously get their temperature taken on a regular basis, as do the staff every morning. But I think that that's an important factor. Having the options available, having the commitment of the team to their care and management, and having a team that's sensitive to the difficulties that exist in cross-communication with other family members continues to be a real strength of, I believe, the research enterprises as they move forward. I mean, Nita, what's your experience been?
Yeah, I mean, I think for our patients, especially, oncology patients, it was with the whole pandemic starting, it was a lot of fear, right? It was fear of COVID, just like the general population, but fear given that they were at increased risk with COVID, and then the fear of their cancer and what's going to happen to their cancer treatment. So, a lot of, stress, a lot of questions that came to us up front. And just as Dr. Gordon mentioned, I mean, of course, they were extremely happy to adapt to the changes in place. They knew they were for their good, the front door screening, the changes in that they can't go to the infusion centers that they're normally going to. We used to do a lot of same-day chemo. You see your doctor, you get the chemo the same day, but our policy then was that the chemo has to be at one of our satellite centers. So you see the doctor and the next day you go to one of the satellite centers because the main campus, the infusion rooms were occupied and one was converted into a COVID unit. So, they've been extremely accepting of all the changes and extremely grateful. I think, the gratitude does come across, yes, they have to learn to wear their masks. We had to re-educate them that, no, this is important. You have to put it on when you're in with the patient, but they were willing to, adapt to that. They know that the changes are for their benefits ultimately. I think the one thing, yes, as you mentioned, the limitation of visitor policy was the one thing that not everybody was happy about, but they accepted knowing that this was important, especially for some of those getting admitted. Even we had restricted patients who were admitted, who are the family members you can have in the room or who are the ones who can have family members in the room. So,
I think, sorry. Go on.
No, I was just saying, so yes, they've, they appreciate having their treatments going forward as is. They do appreciate coming and seeing us in person, but they also do appreciate the non-essential visits, like even on clinical trial, to have that done virtually because, as you know, at least for our center, we have patients who are traveling a big distance. And as for Dr. Gordon as well, for phase 1s, some patients are actually traveling quite a distance to come. So if it is a visit that is for a toxicity assessment, and they don't necessarily have to be there, having that, the sponsors give us the ability to do that remotely, virtually, and actually doing those labs remotely, those weekly labs that they have to get done to do that at their local centers has been a big benefit for them. It has decreased their stress with the travel with COVID and, it helped them improve their quality through all of this. So, yeah.
Now, what I was trying to say earlier, I think there is definitely a factor of oncology research being different than bariatric or as you were saying, or dermatology trial, for example, because this is the medium for the patient to get sometimes the best care possible. But I think there is a big element of patient engagement from the site as well, and the commitment from the investigators like you to show that you're following the protocol of, related to cleaning. And I think patient centricity is very important. Patient centricity such as to cut down the burden on the patient. As you said, some of the toxicity labs can be done remotely. Some of the PKs are good to have. You don't have to have those PK, and patient doesn't have to stay longer at the center. But I think there is still a long way to go for pharma and the life sciences organization to ensure there is a consistent, transparent, and authentic interaction with the patient, which means there is a personalized approach rather than just specific targeted touch points, which actually is perceived by the patients that they are only valuable to the company involved, and not so much so for the patient. So there is still a long way to go about patient centricity, and I think both US FDA as well as EMA, European Medicine Agency, they are helping to accelerate to bring that change. And I think with this pandemic, it has become even more visible that patient centricity has to be the center of clinical research.
I think that's a very good point. I was thinking as you were speaking, we live in a world as clinical investigators that we're very, very fixated on wanting to stay within the barriers of the protocol and do what we're asked to do, recognizing that if we go outside those barriers, there are implications relative to having to report that to the IRB or the FDA. And I think the FDA is jumping in early to ease restrictions and to redefine what the critical necessities were, was very, very helpful for very busy sites to get back on track and behaving in their normal fashion.
Yeah. Now, patient centricity is such an evolving space, and I think really pharmaceutical industry, investigators, CROs, they need to understand what complex patient journey a patient goes through to participate in a trial, and put that really at the heart of clinical research.
And I agree. I mean, when I write my own trials now, I'm thinking like, what are things that are actually essential to get done, and look at it from the patient's journey and what they have to do when you're dealing with somebody with advanced cancer and the visits they have to make. I mean, of course, we want to do research and get all the data we want because that's how we move the field forward. But there are a lot of small things that get put in that were not actually essential and just part of habit being followed from one protocol to the other. And those things can be removed or not absolutely essential. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I've got 2 more question prompts here before we move to our question and answer session. So I want to remind the audience, we've got plenty of good questions, but we want to keep them coming. So please use that Q&A button at the bottom of your box right down there and submit those questions. And I'm going to move on to our next question prompt so we cover as much material as possible. Let's talk about patient recruitment. So how has recruitment and retention changed? What do you like and what do you think should continue after the pandemic?
So, patient recruitment, and of course, has changed in the sense recruitment and retention. There have been patients who are traveling across the country and some international patients coming in for certain trials. So there's obviously been a decrease in the ability to recruit patients not from in town, given the situation that was ongoing, because the risk with COVID was changing so rapidly, and we had to just evolve the way we did things, evolve whether we're allowed to see patients in person from these particular states. Do they need a COVID test before they come in? And now we have all those systems in place. We do COVID tests for new patients, and only those the follow-up patients are only if they have symptoms. So we have that in place. So I think the recruitment and retention did drop. There were patients who were set to go on study and then decided that they're going to hold off because they can't do those multiple weekly trips that were required as part of the trial. But now I think starting June, when we had things in place and people kind of understood the long-term nature of this pandemic and it not going away, they are figuring out how to incorporate and get their cancer treatment. And even, there's been a slump in even the screening for cancer, like screening for cancer. I saw one of the questions, and we'll come to it later. So, but patients are now coming back to say that we can't hold off on this for too long. So we did see a surge of patients coming back in June, July, and now it's again, leveling off. Now, what do I think I like and should continue after the pandemic? I mean, the fastest adoption of virtual care, where we were getting so much pushback about, we used to consult for patients from out of town, and often for a follow-up visit, it would have been great to have, rather than communicating via email or phone, to actually have a setup for virtual delivery of care. And so having that setup is a help. I think there are some things that you can't substitute for an in-person visit, and you need to see the patient in person, but there are a lot of those in-between visits that can easily be done virtually, and it does help. That's the feedback I'm getting from some of the patients, that they do like that. So I think that's something to stay about getting non-essential labs. Non-essential, I mean, like if it's not a biomarker or PK that requires to be processed immediately, even those potentially can be drawn at a local standard lab. But getting those very frequent labs in a local setting, I think, is important for patients who are on oral therapy trials that are kind of long-term, and they're in their 6th month of their therapy. I think if the visits are only every 2 months, being able to ship the medicine, clinical trial medication to the patient is actually a big advantage rather than having them fly in. So there's some things that if we think that they have, it's been successful through this time frame, and we've been able to do it successfully with this remote structure, I think are here to stay. And you'll talk about it probably, this, auditing and remote monitoring of sites might also be something that is here to stay. So we'll see. What about you, Dr. Gordon?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that we've begun to do is to do a much more comprehensive pre-visit assessment with patients, and really kind of spend more time ensuring that we have a very good handle on the new consults that are coming in, and even doing remote new consultation visits to assess the general status of patients' well-being and performance status. I think we, in general, in our patient population, find that one of the most common reasons why patients are not eligible is a poor performance status, which is really about dialoguing and engaging and actually seeing a patient, but not necessarily in person. And it's really helped us to be able to carry on some of those visits remotely before actually pressing patients to have to come in, particularly those that are sicker. May have more concerns about coming to a medical office or the hospital. So I agree with you in that regard. And I think that the easing of certain restrictions have definitely made it easier for our staff to carry on as usual as possible. And, electronic medical records make it much easier to document things as you parse information from patients.
And one aspect is like remote consenting. I know it's a little bit controversial, but sometimes, I mean, and again, in a phase 1 setting, it's different because you probably have to see patients if they're not under your ongoing care. But a lot of times, like if we have patients under our ongoing care, and I saw them, and then we see their scans later, and we know them, the trials that have allowed the initial remote consent has actually been very helpful, because that's a visit that you can only order the screening test or get the screening test after they have signed the remote consent or signed the consent. So in certain trials where it makes sense, and if the patient has had a recent enough visit with the physician and you're doing a good enough job on that virtual visit to review the consent with the patient, it's actually helpful, because then they can come in for their screening test, and it's one trip for their screening test, and then you see them right before cycle 1, day 1 in person. But that remote consent has allowed a lot of flexibility for our patients who want to be part of the clinical trials.
Yeah, and I think it's a representation of how technology is probably going to escalate significantly from this event to hopefully the advantage of our patients.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely. I think we are saying the same things about the patient burden and patient centricity. And I think now more than ever, I think it's important that patients are being involved in how we design the studies, and so we can enhance their patient their experience, and that will have a direct input into the patient retention and the trial value. And by ensuring that the study designs are tailored to the reality of every day and everyday life of a participant, we can help ensure to actually do the recruitment on time and complete on time. So I think with the help of technology and with the change in the thinking as well, as you were just saying earlier, some of the processes in the studies are good to have, because I want more data. More data is good data. That was the approach. But I think now we have to do with what is actually needed to meet the primary endpoints. What is actually needed to meet the primary objectives. Because if you've seen a lot of protocols now, when I started in clinical research, there used to be a primary objective and the secondary objective. Now there are tertiary and further on as well, because you're doing a lot of exploratory research now. I think this is going to stick on, and with the help of the technology, we should be able to reduce a lot of burden on the patients.
All right. All right. Well, we can keep great questions from the audience. Keep them coming. I have just one more question prompt for our panel before we move to that. And so let's go to it. Moving past the pandemic, let's dive into novel therapies. Increasing trial complexity is requiring new infrastructure and technology. So what have you found to be the best when it comes to building a site network, and how to expand the network of qualified sites?
Yeah, so this is a big challenge. And I think as we look at novel therapies, we're dealing with, for example, some therapies that may be intratumoral injections and require certain skill sets from interventional radiology or the providers themselves. New drugs that require closer monitoring, particular cellular therapies that may require inpatient monitoring to address and screen for any cytokine release syndrome that we may see. And those kind of come directly into conflict with the current environment because of COVID-19. I think as we've begun to expand, what we've taken to is utilizing the resources that exist within our city to utilize the reference points around the city within the associated and affiliated practices to be able to be points of contact for patients who are interested in trials, may be eligible for trials, and then importantly, depending upon what's happening and what they may or may not be eligible for, having other options for them. I think the creation of site networks is tremendously complex and probably will continue to be complex because of the expected surge of new cancer patients that I expect to see on the heels of the pandemic, as was mentioned earlier, with delays in screening. But we're excited at the prospect of developing those collaborations and partnering with other programs who are similarly minded with a focus on our patients.
Right. Kind of mirror some of that. So, novel therapies. So there are two things, of course, one is novel therapies and getting access to these novel therapies on clinical trial to, to have it more far reaching. So like we have our Houston area network locations, and through this pandemic, as we were getting our clinical trial operations back up, the big push was also how to get the, the clinical trials more available at these network locations and set the process up so that we are monitoring it from what we call the mothership or whatever at the main center, but giving them equal, chance to enroll patients and have the, the research nurse that oversees the whole thing at even the network sites. So you have to set them up appropriately in order for them to be successful at accruing and conducting the study appropriately. When you talk about, of course, increasing complexity, things like cellular-based therapies, TIL therapies, as you mentioned, intratumoral therapies, it does take a lot more because, we have the whole setup to do these T-cell trials. We also have a facility that actually manufactures these agents. We had to train the inpatient area as well. So there's a lot of training that goes into the nursing and the inpatient setting to do this. So it's just more involved, and you want to make sure everybody is trained, not only the research nurse, but also the inpatient nurses in how to manage these patients and manage the side effects. And even investigators, not all investigators are up to speed with the cellular-based therapies. So we have a whole CAR-Tox committee. In order to be able to run any of those studies, you have to be part of that. You have to attend those meetings, and you have to, meet the training requirements. Now, when you go into one of these, of course, I would want patients, ultimately, when these therapies get approved, you want patients to be able to access it everywhere. So a little of, there is our responsibility to make sure if you have sites and investigators who have expertise in that area and are knowledgeable, to maybe help them set up their sites to run these, trials, so that when these, agents become available for standard use, they're more comfortable in executing it and are trained, and we have less errors at that point. So I think it's, it's going to be challenging, but I think not impossible, because as more and more of these trials come, just one center can't run all of them. So you need to, pick centers all across the US and make sure they're, set up in order to run these complex studies.
Gaurav, do you have anything to add on the CRO perspective before I move on to the Q&A?
Yeah, sure. I think from the CRO's perspective and from the pharma perspective, something which I was discussing with Dr. Somaya and Dr. Gordon earlier, one of the challenges we have is, as you said, right now these centers who can actually have the infrastructure in terms of, the infrastructure to have activities such as, cell handling experience, or, IP storage, a chain of custody, transport of IP from the storage, and, as simple as where you're going to do the thawing at the bedside, how it's going to be infused. There are very limited centers. And these centers, such as yours and Honor Health, they have like slight differentiation, but like 10 to 12 to 15 protocols, which begs two questions. One is how we're going to expand the infrastructure to be able to conduct more trials. And secondly, these are novel therapies, and probably the access to these novel therapies only by participating in the clinical trials. And now to participate in these clinical trials, some patients are traveling from West Coast to East Coast sometimes. It's just an example, maybe I'm exaggerating, but they're traveling far because the numbers of the centers are limited where you can conduct such trials. So in your vision, as key investigator at your center, how do you see this expansion of centers going into, spreading into, how do you see this infrastructure build in future to be able to have more widespread centers to be able to run this trial?
So, I mean, how we see it develop is through collaboration, because, even in academic centers and non-academic centers as well that are good at running trials, as I said, if you identify folks who have interest, there will be a big learning curve. I mean, I think, maybe centers who are experts at doing this should be incentivized in some way to help set up another center that has been identified to at least have the key aspects of that infrastructure required to help those centers up and running. And as you said, we already have a lot of patients from East and West Coast coming to us, and they also, as you were correct in saying, sometimes they travel all across to be part of these studies. So, making sure we have sites, distributed well all through the US with expertise in running these studies, and to have the qualified centers overseeing these new centers for some time, in terms of making sure when that one patient, making sure they're taken through correctly through all steps of that, of their treatment, is important.
Yeah. No, thank you.
I would second that. And I think that, most programs that are heavily invested in doing novel therapies, novel technologies, have a very well-entrenched professional relationship with similarly minded physicians and programs. And so while you might not necessarily have the closest knit relationship and collaboration, I think Dr. Somaya's point is well taken, that all boats rise when patients have opportunities that are accessible to them, and not every patient has the ability to travel great distances. And this is the kind of thing that we need to be working on in order to ensure that patients can access new drugs, because we just look at this last generation of therapies and the ability for many of us to actually talk to patients about the potential for durable remissions of metastatic disease because of, immunotherapies, is something that was really not considered years ago, and I think represents the holy grail of what we're trying to pursue in terms of eradicating cancer.
Thank you, Dr.
All right, wonderful. Yeah, thank you for that. All right, so we've got about 19 minutes left in our session here today. We've got tons of great questions from the audience. I want to encourage the audience to keep asking the questions, because there's a bunch. I'm going to get to as many as I possibly can. I'm going to just advance this to the Q&A slide, and I'm going to ask this question first. All right. So how are the institutions handling screening and testing for COVID-19 and oncology patients in context of the clinical trial participants? Are institutions following local standard procedures, or are the institutes doing their own screening and own protocols into the clinical trial protocols?
So I can talk a little bit about patients on, so we instituted early on for any, TIL-based or T-cell. So there were certain protocols that we made it mandatory for patients, especially the ones that required inpatient admission, to get COVID tested before their, their treatment. So like if they're coming for lymphodepletion for a T-cell therapy, before lymphodepletion, we needed to have their negative COVID test. So that was a requirement. Now for other trials, that's just standard trials that they're coming in and getting their IV treatment or oral therapy. Initially there was a requirement, but now it's gone down to just, based on if you've had a contact, if you some high risk contact, or if you've had any symptoms whatsoever, then you get COVID tested. So our COVID testing and then we have restricted it for new patients who are coming into MD Anderson. So follow-up patients don't always, if they're going on to a trial now, don't need a COVID test unless it is a procedure that they're undergoing like surgery or they're coming into the hospital. And we are requiring patients to have their COVID test at MD Anderson because there is a little bit, I've had a family member do a drive-through CVS, and we don't know how long it takes. We don't know the quality of the test. So there was a lot of, it took a lot of time to standardize what test is good, what's not. So we're comfortable with what they're doing at Anderson. And so we required them to get that test, done at the institution.
Dr. Gordon, how about at Honor Health?
Yeah, we're employing a similar technique. Our patients who are entering into the hospital, whether it be for biopsies or any procedure, protocol or not protocol related, or needing to be electively admitted for the administration of a therapy, all must be COVID tested and generally within 24 hours. And we're doing our own in-house rapids to be able to assess that. I think otherwise, all of our patients are being screened. All of our patients are being called the day before their visits to elaborate whether they've been traveling, whether they've been exposed to known infected individuals, and whether they're having symptoms. And on that basis, then deciding whether they require treatment, require testing. We haven't been doing testing in the clinics. So, here in Phoenix, our enterprise, our hospital system has several open urgent care facilities that said COVID testing facilities. And if somebody is ill, then we're sending them there where they can be assessed by a healthcare provider, get testing done, get a chest x-ray if necessary, and then a rapid decision is made whether they can go home and wait for results while quarantining or need to be sent to the hospital. And so I think it's about rapidly establishing best practices for the patients, particularly understanding that they may be at higher risk for complications.
Okay. All right, let me get to another question here, and maybe I can just get a very quick answer from each of you on this one. Do you think that the focus on accelerating COVID care, like Operation Warp Speed and the number of clinical trials being started, do you think all of this will speed up cancer drug development? How about you, Dr. Somaiya?
It's a short answer is I don't know. I don't know if it's going to speed up because, it is challenging in terms of, we still need to follow the process of actually conducting the trials in order to do drug development. And I don't know if
so jury's still out for you then?
Yes.
Okay. How about you, Dr. Gordon?
Yeah, I do think it's going to transform some of the things we do. I think we're seeing more pharmaceutical companies understanding what we've classically talked about in go, no go decision making, which they're applying to COVID drugs. And now we hear them talking about similarly applying them to oncology drugs. I think that the speed with which we've seen regulatory affairs, project management work will ultimately bleed over, if you will, to oncology and hopefully facilitate some of those activities.
Yeah, and I hope it does. The hope is that it does.
We all hope. Gaurav, how about your opinion on this one?
I am with Dr. Gordon on this one. I think there is definitely some lesson learned you can have from this, warp speed. which can be applied to, means there is already a lot of, new programs FDA started like 10 years ago. Like there is a, accelerated approval, fast track designation, and you also have, compassionate IND. There are some programs where you can actually fast track some of the developments. And I think from the warp seed itself as well, there will be some learning which can be applied to some of the new programs, which might be applicable to oncology drug development too.
Okay. All right. I've got a pair of questions here. It's a very specific question, and it's going to require an expert answer. Okay. So when a trial patient contracts COVID-19, is that reported as an adverse event? And is it, especially if severe or fatal or not necessarily? That's part one of the question. Part two is, if an oncology patient in a clinical trial tests positive for COVID-19, what happens to their participation in that trial? Dr. Somaiya or Dr. Gordon?
Okay. I can go. So the first part, so anything that happens on the trial gets documented as an AE, whether related or not is the next question, right? So we will be documenting it, and then whether it's a related event or non-related, in most cases it would be unrelated, whether the severity or the fatality of it is because of your low counts because you're on part of a trial, then that becomes a little bit more complex to determine whether you would have expected them. But their underlying cancer itself puts them at risk. So I don't think necessarily the treatment. So I think that's still evolving. In terms of a patient test positive, this is an interesting question because it came up a lot with our discussions with the sponsors. What would you do? So for standard of care therapies, if a patient is asymptomatic COVID positive, and they absolutely require their treatment, we're actually continuing them. We put them on the COVID floor and we treat them. We give them the chemotherapy or whatever standard of care is required. So as part of a trial, we would hope that if we can determine that they are not going to develop severe symptoms or they're asymptomatic, though we would stop at the time of, when they got tested positive, we would be able to start back on therapy if they stay without symptoms, as long as the sponsor is okay with it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the CDC guidance, obviously, for treating and ASCO guidance for taking care of COVID patients has evolved reasonably rapidly. And so, I think I suspect Nina feels the same way. Our focus is always advocating for what we believe is going to be best for our patients. And for those patients who are asymptomatic, are COVID positive, can quarantine and get through 10 days, the current guidance beyond symptoms would lead me to want to keep that patient on a drug, particularly if they're gaining clinical benefit, because I think it's in their best interest. I think the challenge becomes, if patients get admitted to the hospital, you obviously have to define that as an SAE just because of the hospitalization. But I think in those settings, we're often faced with the dilemma of having to discontinue or interrupt therapies because we just don't know how they're going to engage with the infection.
Okay. All right. Let me move on to another question. I think, Gaurav, this question might be directed for you specifically. So the EMA does not allow for remote SDV. How would you suggest sponsors of clinical oncology studies that are multinational can put pressure on the EMA and, where necessary, other authorities, let's say the FDA, to change this?
Sure. I think so. That's a very, very interesting question, and we face this challenge almost every day for our global programs. So EMA does not allow remote SDV. I think it's a very broad statement, but because there are very strict GDPR regulation, global data protection requirements, guidelines in Europe, which doesn't allow you to have access to patient records without securing the right EC approval, without ensuring that there is a redacting protocol in place, so you don't get to see any confidential information. But I think EMA has also, so EMA is a larger organization, but within the EMA you have different countries. And I can tell you that Denmark, the Dutch authority, Denmark has actually was the first one to say that they are allowing remote SDV for the period leading up to the end of September. And at the end of September, they will see what is the status with the pandemic to do the benefit risk assessment, whether it is still beneficial to continue allowing the remote SDV. Similarly, other countries within the European Union has taken a very similar approach as well. Not all, by the way. There are still some countries who are sticking with the guidelines. There is absolutely no remote SDV. They've taken upon the guidelines to say we are, opening it for a short period of time, saying you can access you can do the remote SDV, but that's not set in the guidelines or as a legal requirement. So they are not saying that there is still a very strict GDPR regulation, but for the time being, given that the pandemic is going on, they are giving opportunities for the CROs or the pharma to be able to continue with their research. So it's when you're running a trial in Europe, you have to really evaluate country by country what are the effective guidelines at this given time to be able to access the data.
You're mute, Arslan. You're mute.
And that's such a rookie move towards the end of our webinar too. Sorry about that. So we've got tons and tons of questions. Thank you, Dr. Gordon. Let me ask you guys this, a real quick one. How do you think the pandemic will impact the adoption of non-invasive biomarkers, especially the ones that have raised prominence in recent years?
So I think that, obviously the biomarker element, whether it's metabolic, genomic, are critical for defining patients who may get greatest benefit out of targeted therapies. And then, of course, the post-treatment on clinical trial biomarkers or PD assessments are important for defining potential options in the future. I think we're finding that analyzing molecular testing and assessing patients on that basis has become critical, mostly because our goal is to get patients in contact with the best option as quickly as possible.
I would agree. I think these non-invasive biomarkers are going to be used more and more and are part and more of the clinical trials that we run. Of course, there is a little bit of standardization, especially with the rare diseases I take care of, is that you probably still need the biopsy as part of the trial to confirm that those non-invasive biomarkers are truly, their sensitivity and specificity to what we're actually testing. So, but we're going to see more and more of it, I think.
Arslan, in the interest of time, I think there are a lot of questions, and we will get back to all the questions. I want to pick up one question specifically for Dr. Gordon, Dr. Nisa, Dr. Samaya to address, which is in the current environment, who are the decision makers at the institutions for evaluating whether or not to take on new trials, and what are those criteria?
Yeah, so here it's been internal within the Research Institute, and within oncology, it's been the Medical Oncology Core and our Cellular Therapy Core, though I think it's important that one of the things that we've stressed when sitting and meeting is looking not so much just at the drug or the therapeutic, but looking at its downstream implications on the program itself. It's amazing the impact that COVID has had on everybody that is engaged with and touches patients, particularly our inpatient nurses, who have just been fantastic about taking care of patients. But when you call upon that overstretched resource to have to then take on new opportunities, I think we've had to be very selective. And it's caused everybody to have to sit back and say, okay, what are my goals in the short-term area relative to how we're going to keep things going and what we're going to test? And, there are some trials that you see that you go, this is a really exciting trial, I'd like to do it. And then there are others that you see and you say, oh, this is an interesting trial. I think I'll do it because I don't have anything filling that gap right now. And I think Nita touched on this earlier. It really has forced the program to ponder the relative value and importance of certain trials and certain populations, what is mission critical versus what may overburden the enterprise.
Yeah, I would agree. And in Anderson, we had the whole clinical research structure was the ones making decisions. And they initially were very restrictive and laid down very strict guidelines of what can be opened or what can stay open. And we had to, as each department had to submit our trials to them to get their okay to keep them running. As we got our systems, as I said, in place and things are opened up now, there is just a broad guideline, and each department has the decision-making capacity as long as you're able to follow. Just as Dr. Gordon said, like if there is a trial that is great to do, but you're expecting a lot of patients to end up in the hospital with complications after, probably not the best thing to you're going to have a lot of pulmonary complications. You got to think about those things as well. So the idea is to put in more thought to whatever you're going to open than you were doing before as to how much is it going to impact on the patients and to the system as such in order to run it.
Yeah, I think from CRO point of view, we are also seeing that some of the centers are becoming very selective of the trials in terms of the scientific rationale or the value it adds to to the existing treatment, for example. So if we have had some examples where we had a Me Too drug, such as one of the PARP, I'm just going to use some random examples, such as one of the PARP inhibitor used for ovarian cancer, and they're saying, oh, there are already a lot of PARP inhibitors, and this PARP inhibitor of yours doesn't offer any extra value over the one which is already existing. And we are seeing the investigators saying, the center saying, we have to rationalize our resources, so we're going to say no to this trial. So I think we are seeing that trend as well going on a little bit.
All right. That's all the time we have for today. And there are tons of unanswered questions over here, and the Worldwide team is going to do their best to get back to you promptly by email. I want to thank my panel, Doctors Michael Gordon and Nita Samaya. I'd also thank you, Gaurav Sharma with Worldwide. Also, I just want to let the whole audience know if you'd like to learn more about how Worldwide may be able to help your oncology trial, please contact them at worldwide.com. I want to thank the entire audience for joining us today. For Endpoints News, I am Arsalan Arif. Thank you.
Thank you
very much.